Afternoon, everyone. So my name is Zach Schalk. I'm the editor-in-chief of Gnovis. We are Georgetown University's student-run peer-reviewed journal of communication, culture, and technology. So welcome to our 4th annual spring conference, which we're calling gnoviCon 15, Unlocking Open Data. So first, I'd like to start with some thank yous. Thank you to our Gnovis staff for their hard work in organizing and pulling off this event. Thank you to the Healy Family Student Center for hosting us today, and thank you to the CCT faculty, staff, and student community for your continued support throughout the year. Thank you to our fantastic speakers and panelists for joining us today and making this an exciting event. And finally, thank you to all of you in the audience for braving the cold and snow to be here. At the very least, I can promise you a warm room for the rest of the afternoon, so please feel free to join us all afternoon. So as I mentioned earlier, Gnovis is supported by CCT, Georgetown's diverse interdisciplinary graduate program focused on studying the history of and interactions between communication technologies and culture. In the true spirit of the CCT program, today's event is for both experts and interested novices alike. In the spirit of full disclosure and transparency, I'm certainly no expert on data collection or its use. Instead, like many of you, I'm merely a curious student looking to gain some new insights into the data-flooded world in which we now live. For people like me, we hope that you leave here today with some newfound sense of literacy with open data sets, the readily available, interoperable, and reusable lifeblood of the 21st century economy. For the experts in the audience, we hope that today's discussions and activity further enriches and deepens your understanding and appreciation of open data sets and their use. Now to introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to present you with Dr. David Lightfoot, acclaimed linguist, former assistant director of the National Science Foundation, and current director of CCT. Thank you.
So Gnovis has been around for a few years and has done great work in getting CCT students into the world of online publishing. Selecting papers, soliciting papers, and then getting them out. And that's been important for a long time. But over the last few years, the levels have been raised by the Gnovis leadership, and it's become a more of a focus within CCT for CCT ideas about the origins and consequences of new technology. And this year, the level has raised again. So to add to the thanks, I want to thank the leadership of Gnovis. The one person in the room at the moment who is not happy is the next year's leader of Gnovis, who knows that the bar has to be raised another level, okay. Which may involve fitness training and the technology associated with that. So the theme for this year, big data, open data. In the CCT world, the technology world, we're used to living in bubbles. Hype for one new form of technology over another one. A few years ago, there was a tremendous focus and somewhat hyperbolic in some ways on MOOCs. And now things have sort of settled down in certain ways, and people have come to recognize that there are opportunities with large-scale online teaching, but also there are obstacles and limitations, and as we engage more with that, so there will be progress. The current bubble is big data, and there are claims made out there that with big data, everything will be transformed, is a line that you commonly hear. So I would like to, since you give me the opportunity to introduce the speaker, we'll get to the speaker in a second, but to urge caution. Not everything will be transformed by big data. Some things will be, some things have been, right? But big data needs to interact with big ideas. If you look back over the history of science, the history of innovation. Some new developments have come in response to large data, but by no means everything. And certainly in the more mature sciences, it's theoretical ideas that often are responding to very small but important data sets that bring innovation. My job is to introduce our keynote speaker. I remember very vividly the first time I met Bob. It was, I can even give you the date, because it was my first day of work at the National Science Foundation. And one of the things that the National Science Foundation organizes the sciences, cuts the scientific pie into slices, and I was heading up the human sciences, economics, psychology, archaeology, and so forth. And on my first day, I had a baptism of fire having to meet the advisory committee. And NSF is very good on sort of developing science and seeing itself as a sort of way of organizing the scientific community. And the advisory committees are one part of this. So basically all policy decisions that affect the human sciences go through the advisory committee. And Bob was chair of the advisory committee. And I learned that day of a number of personal qualities that I've since come to see in larger scale. And at the time, he was a professor at the University of Michigan, a specialist in survey methodology. And one of the units within the Social Behavioral Economic Directorate was what was called at the time Science and Engineering Statistics. So this was a group that gathered statistics on funding for science and engineering, where the funding was going, what the effects of it were, what the effects of various policy initiatives that were introduced, and so forth. And this was Bob's domain. He was the expert, so I actually met him before the meeting with people from the Science and Engineering Statistics unit. That was my first day of work for the federal government. Then Bob, when the Obama administration came in, Bob was nominated as director of the US Census Bureau. I've never asked him about his first day of work there, but I can imagine, okay. This was in mid-2009, and what immediately loomed, large is not a big enough adjective, over the US Census Bureau at that time was within a year or so, they would be running the next decennial census, the 2010 census. And I think it's fair to say that things were a mess. It was over budget. They had not engaged with technology. And this is what Bob confronted on his first day of work. By the time he left the Census Bureau, the 2010 census had been run. The participation in the census, I think it went up to 74% from 72%, but the idea of participation in a survey, certainly a survey of that scale, increasing over a 10-year period was just unheard of. And one of the ways that Bob contributed to that was by going out to the Hispanic community and meeting them in various town halls and so forth, and essentially convincing them that this was not another method of surveillance, but it was in their interests to be counted. And that was one factor in the increased participation within the census. And by the time Bob left the Census Bureau, the 2010 census had come in well under budget and with the increased participation. And I think a case could be made that this is one of the most successful leaderships of a federal agency when Bob ran the Census Bureau. But that wasn't enough. Having run the census and run it successfully, he decided to go on to more difficult challenges, and he came to Georgetown as provost. And has been here now for 2.5 years and has made many changes and has been getting the university to engage more with technology and big data and little data in a variety of ways. So please welcome Bob Groves.
So is it running off the drive? Oh, no, there you go. Okay. Okay. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. What you're doing, let me speak to the students for a minute. This is really cool that you're doing this. Don't ever stop doing this. The fact that you've mounted a journal is a really cool thing that you'll never regret. Those of you who are working on it, whether you know it or not, are learning a bunch of things that you'll take advantage of later in life, I'm convinced, so keep it up. What I thought I'd do is, I need to define a few terms because our language right now is all messed up. So let me just do big data for a minute, which is not well defined, I believe. But for purposes of my talk, think of data sets so big that you can't afford to move them from where they are. So this is a world where we will no longer acquire a data set that you may access a data set, but it won't ever really be resident in your domain. And I'd include, I'm pretty eclectic, I'd include social media data, so-called administrative data or process data, sensor data. So that's all in scope for what I would talk about. Open data I view as kind of a different thing. It may or may not be big data under the definition I gave. It's really a movement that started, I don't know, depends on how you count, about 2006 or 7 in the British Commonwealth countries first, then in 2008 in 9 in the US. It's really an action of democracies around the world that flows from the notion that transparency is a good thing for democracies. And one thing we ought to be transparent about is tons of digital data that government agencies have. Some of those open data aren't particularly complicated or big. They're just open. They're for us to use in various ways. So I'm going to be a little off topic with your permission. I'm sorry. I'm going to focus more on what I think is a real kind of scientific puzzle, and I'm happy to talk to you about it because my generation and even Lisa's generation isn't going to solve this problem. It's going to be your generation that will solve it because it's one of these moments in time where we have to hybridize a bunch of knowledge, and it always takes almost a generation, or at least an intellectual generation, to do that. So we're going to be messed up for a while. It means that the only way we're going to make progress is to have people from different backgrounds work together, and that's the hardest thing in life. But we're going to do that for a while until we create people with the knowledge of multiple approaches, and then we'll take off. So I want to assert a couple of things. One is that the kind of social scientists I hang out with have been heavily dependent on sample survey data for the advances that they want to make. And I'll talk about that for a minute because it provides a particular paradigmatic way of thinking. And that discipline, that framework, is problematic in our new data world. And I want to highlight that. So I've used in some of my writing this term organic data instead of big data. Just to note one other property of these data, they are created by systems that the researcher has no control over. It's really part of an ecosystem now. We as researchers can harvest those data and try to glean information from them, but we never control them. And in that sense, they're just growing up out of our control, hence the organic word. I want to talk about what that probably means or speculate that. And then the third point is the big point. Because of the properties of old sample surveys and new big data, we're not going to make a big switch. We have to go through a period of time to blend the two together. I want to make the case for that. And that's what you guys ought to be working on, it seems to me. Okay, so the sample survey paradigm relies on control over a measurement process and control over the identification of the measurement units. It starts with the existence of what is sometimes called a sampling frame, a list, if you will, of all people. These are usually large populations that you would like to understand. And then it selects a sample of those, but then it rigorously controls the data. So, I hang out with people who have devoted their entire lives to one question on the unemployment survey. They have parsed every possible meaning of every word and every combination of words. They know how different subcultures in the US understand the words differently. They understand the response mechanisms that produces an answer, I don't know, and what I don't know might mean. They've devoted their lives to that individual measure, okay? If you think about this new world we're moving into, it's a very different world, right? Where you don't know what produced the datum that you're looking at. The final bullet here is also important. What happened to quantitative social science from sort of 1970 on is that multivariate modeling became an inherent, coin of the realm. So if you're a researcher and you can control the measurement properties and you've bought into this notion that only through multivariate modeling will you understand what's going on, then you want really long data records, right? You want to measure a whole lot of things on the same unit. That's the only way you can do your modeling. So if you happen, God bless you, to fall into the sample of the Consumer Price Index, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, a very nice person will visit your home and will ask you questions for 2.5 hours. How many pairs of socks have you bought in the last 3 months? How much did you pay for those socks? Did you shop in multiple stores before you bought the socks? The data record on that survey goes on and on. Thousands of variables are measured on the sample. So that's the last point. So let's look at this in sort of a graphical sense. A lot of the efforts that I was involved in had as an interesting population the entire US population, people who live in the US, whether you're citizens or not. So that's now about 330 million people, okay. If you had no limits on time and money, you would measure all of them. But there are generally limits on time and money, so you measure a sample of them. That sample is drawn from this thing called a frame, and the sample is attempted to be measured. In every developed country of the world right now, the gap between the sample and the respondents is growing. Fewer and fewer people are saying, oh yeah, I'd like to do your 2.5-hour survey, come on in. Because of that, the costs of sample surveys are rising rapidly, okay? The little cloud between the sample and the frame is assisted by a set of pretty rigorous probability theories. You can write out, other things being equal, the inferential limits from the sample to that frame. And that's what allowed the whole thing to work for many decades. What the probability theory doesn't help you on is if you don't fully measure that sample. And the big bugaboo right now in surveys is that gap, as I just said, right? So probability theory helps when you have fully measured the sample to jump to the population through the frame. Now, the big data paradigm, if there's a paradigm, it really hasn't been defined, puts a big cloud between whatever data set you're doing, and this is a little example of Facebook and Twitter, and whatever population you're interested in. And if you just stop for a minute and think of every statistic you've seen out of Twitter and Facebook, ask the question, how rigorously defined was the population being described? And I think you'll find that in most presentations of statistics off of those sources, there's not much attention to that. Rarely does the author say, this is a summary of behaviors or attitudes of Facebook subscribers, and Facebook subscribers differ from the full US population or the full world population in the following ways. So when you see this statistic, keep that in mind, right? I guess I've never seen that. Maybe you've seen it. If you have an example of that, I'd love to see it. So to put this together, that little red box there is a bunch of stuff that people have worked on for decades. These are statistical and mathematical theories. You know, this is theorem proof stuff where you can really demonstrate the properties of this empirically, and we don't have that. We don't have that framework on the other side. So what surveys are strong on are this inferential property. They've also developed a culture, and actually this is thanks to your old place. NSF was a very prime driver early on to say, if we're as a country or we as a foundation are going to spend millions of dollars mounting a survey, you have to democratize the access to the data. Every social scientist has to have access to that. And so, even when I was a student, I had access to surveys from the National Opinion Research Center. That's why I got in the biz, because it was so much fun just to analyze those data. Now, part of that culture also dealt with disclosure risk reduction. Anonymizing data, if we were in Europe, or quasi-anonymization of data. And there are a whole lot of procedures that were introduced to allow so-called public use data. So right now, you know, you could go back at your laptop and download a subsample of the 2010 census. Those records have gone through a variety of steps to try to minimize the chance that somehow you could re-identify a person whose record is in there. Some of the anonymization is the obvious thing, just stripping off names, addresses, geography. But also, people have gone into the record and perturbed the value of individual variables. So you might have reported, I have an income of $56,236, and there'd be a random error introduced into that changed the value. All of this in an effort to make it hard to re-identify a person. This is a great culture. It is, and the US led on this culture. It transformed quantitative social science in my generation, okay? And then I mentioned this simultaneous measurement. The problem here is obvious. There has been no new federal government survey in the last 10 years, no major one. Every major US government and European government surveys, budgets are just zooming up. Why? Well, when we knock on your door and you say, go away, because of this inferential paradigm, somebody calls back and says, please, please, please. That that calling back just inflates the cost of this. So these costs are just going out of control. They're not timely. By the way, as I'm reading off these attributes, think about big data now, right? Surveys are really slow, lumbering beasts. Just think about this for a minute. We measure in this country the unemployment rate once a month. Once a month. But the unemployment rate is actually changing hourly. Some people don't care about that at all. Once a month is fine. Some investors would like to know the daily unemployment rate because they're speculating in markets where that could move, right? But we're doing it once a month. So they're slow. They're really lousy on spatial specificity. So you cannot know the income of the block next to the campus. It's really unknown. We don't know the average income of that block. And because so much of our work is based on sample surveys, you can't drill down as much. And then I've talked about non-response. So what we're moving into, I sometimes think of a completely new ecosystem. It's self-monitoring a variety of ways. Some of these, what's new about this world is their digital data generally. It's very different than the old world, which I would label now as design data in contrast to this organic data. So that person who spent their whole career on that one question, that question was designed up the kazoo, right? The data we're getting now look different. They're often auxiliary to some process. The data aren't generated to understand attributes. They're auxiliary to some other process. So I assert we got to blend these things together. To give you a sense of why we have to blend these things together, I did this one Saturday, making up the size of the circles. But so I put in that little blue circle, what I labeled organic data. And then if you become a historian of data in the social sciences, you'll realize that in 1960, it was a vastly different world. The central government was the source of most digital data about us and enterprises and so on. But what we look like now is sort of like this. So if you believe, I don't know why you would, but if you believe that McKinsey report that was put out a couple of years ago, they're asserting that the blue circle is increasing at a rate of 40% per year. So I guess I just made this up at 2010. At 2050, you will not be able to see the red circles at all, right? So if you believe McKinsey, and you also know what we've just talked about, the traditional sample survey is not exactly in great shape right now. It becomes really important to understand this new world. And let's talk about the new world. Under this, I would include all the things that you're used to thinking about. CCT is great on thinking about these new data sources, okay? And what's happening now with this stuff? Well, kind of naive things are happening, in my opinion. So Google flu is one of them. So what makes this work? Well, it's as best as anyone can, a mapping of words in search terms to epidemiological characteristics, right? So it flows from an assertion that if I type in things that are related to the flu, like achy shoulders, runny nose, there's a higher likelihood that I indeed am suffering those symptoms, right? Now that isn't talked about very much until the Science article blew Google flu up. But why are people interested in this? It's really timely. You can drill down, or at least Google can drill down spatially. And it mapped to the traditional source which was a surveillance scheme from public health clinics around the country that was really slow, but pretty accurate. And so it turned out Google flu for a long time was a leading indicator of what the CDC estimate was. And everything, that's really neat. You have a leading indicator of the flu epidemic. And it worked until it didn't work. It didn't work at a time where that basic assertion that you can identify a set of words that have high propensity to indicate flu symptoms, that broke down for one reason or another. So this is an example, I think, of we're going to see more and more of this stuff. And what I'm calling for you to do is to get really rigorous about absorbing these things. Why would this work? Under what circumstances would it not work? Has the source revealed what they're actually doing so that I, as a consumer, can assess that? I mean, these are the obligations that we all have, I think. A completely different thing is the billion prices thing. How many people know the billion? Okay, so let me tell you the story on this. Argentina, 2003. If you looked at the government consumer price index, looked like Argentina was in pretty good shape, low inflation of prices. Graduate student in economics from Argentina did not believe it. So he goes in, starts web scraping e-commerce sites that are accessed in Argentina, calculates his own consumer price index just off the e-commerce stuff, right? You can imagine doing that, right? Gets an inflation rate that's completely different. It led, by the way, to a gigantic scandal in the Central Bureau of Statistics in Argentina. It looks like the numbers really were being manipulated, right? So they say, well, this is pretty neat. We could do this for every country. And they start doing it. I think the yellow countries are the ones, whenever I downloaded this or took the screenshot, they're in. And there's an interesting connected story to the billion prices. The consumer price index of the federal government comes out every month. When the Lehman Brothers collapse occurred, the billion prices consumer price index zoomed down for 3 days, and then it recovered. If you look at the adjacent months of the federal consumer price index, there's a little reduction, but you had no insight into the granular temporal shock that the country experienced. And indeed, we've never seen that before. So that's an example of how slow surveys blind us from some phenomena that temporally are really erratic or experience shocks. Right? So to summarize that, these new data are measuring new phenomena. So some of the folks who are just jumping on these individual data sets are in the phase of saying, gee, look at that. We've never seen that before. Isn't that interesting, right? We'll get more of that, I think. Real-time nature of these data are really fascinating. This has got to be a long-run advantage of this new data world. Depending on what data you're looking at and what access you have, they are spatially granular. Whether you can see that in the kind of data you have is dependent on how you've set it up. And then finally, I haven't mentioned this before, a lot of the data that are coming to us are already networked in their tagging. So you can study relationships among people. For some purposes, that's really important. And indeed, it's opened up a literature that existed in the 1970s and died out because it was so hard to get network data. Now it's trivial to get network data, so everything is networked. Not all phenomena are informed by looking at networks, but there are a lot of phenomena that are. The weakness is for almost all of these data sets, we have no idea who's in the group that's possible to be measured. This is a plague for us. And I urge you to avoid the error of logic that if we're not covering everybody, we can make it up by covering a lot of people. So I have a friend who's analyzing network data on Facebook, and he keeps saying, yeah, but I have, 800 million people. And then I say, but who don't you have, and what are their characteristics? And it's not the job of those data producers to worry about that, right? This is how the world is different, right? Their job is not to describe the full population that you might be interested in. Their job is to provide a service and make money. And you're sort of piggybacking on them for social science data analytic purposes. The other thing, and this is the second point, these data sets generally aren't very multivariate. They're real lean in variables. They're really skinny long files. If you think of an observation unit as the row and variables as the columns. Hence, you can't glean a lot of information out of them by themselves. You run out of stuff pretty quickly. The third point is there's a lot of lack of documentation because the purpose of the data construction is not to feed you great social science data that you can analyze. It's to do something else. Data fields change, things are redefined. No one tells you that they've been redefined. So the first analysts of these data sets are often, scarred from learning foibles in the data. There's a lot of text data, and a lot of work that has to go on is to get really rigorous in moving from words to numbers throughout for a lot of different purposes. And then the last point is the access. If you go back to those funny circles I had, the federal government had a deep obligation to make the data open. If I'm a private sector organization, I don't even understand why I would ever want to do that. I could sell you data if you have enough money, but I have no obligation to give you access to data. That's not my mission. That isn't how capitalism works. So that's a problem. So I'm asserting that blending organic and survey data is the job of the next, my hunch is 10 years or so. To do this, there are a set of statistical models that people are now working on that are going to be key to breakthrough. Whenever data sets share attributes, they're a little more desirable for conjoining in various ways. This will not be a very neat world that we move into. It'll be a real messy data world where you'll have two records that may indeed be from similar units or the same unit, and you won't know it fully. It's not deterministic linking in any way. And to do this well, this third bullet is key. Really understanding the nature of the measurement and understanding the nature of the coverage is going to be the coin of the realm. So, this will be a world where I believe the next step will be bringing to bear our traditional measurement devices whose properties we understand, and then conjoining these new data sets in ways that will really be at a modeling step. And we don't know what's going to happen when we do this because we haven't done it. There'll be a lot of false steps, a lot of dead ends. But if we don't do this step, then we've lost a big property of the sample surveys, and that is we don't know what these new data sources are really describing and what they're not describing. We just know there's apparent information in them, but we don't know the extents of the utility of that. So looking forward, I think there are research issues, education issues, and policy issues involved. The research issues, I think I've motivated. The educational issues are, the academy is not producing the right people right now. The kind of blended interdisciplinary program like CCT has all the right ingredients, but we haven't structured courses yet. So it's really hard to become an expert in this right now. You're sort of a half generation ahead of things. That's the work we ought to be doing, as leaders in the academy. There are a bunch of policy issues that are its own talk, but we can't ignore those. So I'm going to stop now, and I think I have time for questions. This is when you talk.
So it's a great setup on the survey versus the organic data, but there may be data that's sort of
In between?
not quite either.
Yep.
And a famous example in one of the popular books on big data is some work that was done by IBM in conjunction with a hospital in Canada, I think it was. It was on premature babies. And premature babies, of course, are monitors, which means there's lots and lots of information of reading the various signs and symptoms that are going on. And they do that because they're worried about survival and infections and other things. And after looking at all this data, IBM, crunch, they came up with a surprising thing that no one had predicted. The surprising thing was about 24 hours before the onset of a potentially fatal fever, they would see a pattern where all of the indicators went flat. They didn't go to zero, they just stopped moving. And they said, what's that all about? And no one really knew. They were all these metaphors. The body is battening down the hatches to get ready for the storm, right? But they didn't know what was going on there. But the nurses took note of that, and when they saw this pattern develop, they started the treatment.
Intervening,
To make sure that
Can you hear him, by the way? I hope you can hear him because I'll not be able to repeat this.
So the question is, they don't know what's going on. They don't know the
Yeah.
causation. They've got this funny pattern, and yet they're acting on it. It's not quite survey data. It's not quite
Yeah,
organic
yeah.
data. It's something in the middle, and it's useful. It's useful information. What do you do about that question?
Okay, so.
The very end of that question, just what do you do with the in between?
So I think the question is really about, I'll define the question so that I can answer it. The question is, sometimes there are spatially confined sources of data. That's one thing. It's one hospital producing tons of data at a granular, probably a temporally granular level. And there appears to be a pattern in the data that is a leading indicator of an outcome you really care about. And you could intervene and stop the outcome. So this is an example that's rich in hooks to what I was trying to say. The first thing that I want to say is there are a lot of ways that we gather evidence about how the world works, right? And sometimes the evidence is I talk to you and you tell me something and I learn something that I didn't know before and I connect it with something else, and that's sometimes valuable evidence. I don't have to go out and do a formal scientific study. So I don't want to downplay the value of this. And then the other aspect of this is how does science progress? And if this is one hospital in Manitoba that has really rich data and you appear to find something that's a real discovery, then I think, as social scientists, our obligation is to see how ubiquitous is this. Is this some quirk of how they clean the hospital and it doesn't generalize at all? And so I'm on that side where I'm jumping to that level pretty quickly. I've chosen to do my work where that's a rigorously defined population and it's big. I don't want to downplay the value of case studies and so on. But I also, let me change your example. There are tons of educational experiments that have been run in classrooms, and they get dynamite results. Randomized experiments, you do everything right, wonderful results, and then you can't generalize it. You try to transport it from one classroom to another, it just doesn't work. So you have a very tight internal validity to your inference, but it just doesn't ramp, and we got to be careful about that too. We can't have all faculty questions, by the way, or I'm walking. Is that how it works?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the ethics of big data. So
Great.
what data that are coming from companies that have their own interests that may be happening without people being fully aware of the data being taken. What are the
Yeah.
a social science, not world?
Okay. Yeah. The answer is yes. So this may surprise you, but I'll be honest with you guys. I think the issue of privacy and data has been captured by the legal profession, and the social scientists haven't stepped up. So there are some aspects of a world where all data are held completely privately that I'd like, but I don't want to live in that world fully because I see all sorts of common good uses. I mean, we could make the world better, right? If we got our act together along the lines we were talking, we could build a better world. And so the real question is, how can we build a better world with these data sets, being respectful of the desires of privacy, not, we know how to make all data private. We would just close down all access. I can imagine a world like that, right? So what's wrong with the discussion, the public discussion, in my opinion now, is we don't have that other side being represented. And all of the stories are about scary breaches, creepy kind of surveillance, that all of us say, ooh. And we haven't had the other story about how we can, sort of like your story, how we can build a better world with these data. We have to conjoin those two and say, we need to talk about these things jointly. And we don't have, if you think about it, we don't have in government, nor really in the nonprofit sector, the spokesperson or the institution that says, common good uses of data, we want common good uses of data. There was a Guardian paper, there was political interference in the Thatcher regime into the unemployment statistics. They redefined the denominator of the unemployment rate, I think it was 52 times during her. And there was a demonstration in front of 10 Downing Street where people were holding placards that said, statistics belong to the people. I love that.
How do you address the trust gap between individuals who feel that the state is not necessarily responsible with their data, given last year's allegations of illegal NSA spying and other such?
Yeah. So I think trust is key, first of all, right? Because none of us know enough to be fully assured that practices will be done. They're deep, complicated technical issues that you can't imagine the public really understand. So it is a matter of trust. So I guess my other opinion, as long as I'm revealing opinions, I don't think in this country the federal government can do this now. I think it's kind of over. And I've been arguing that we need actually a new institution that we don't have now. I don't think the private sector can do it either. We need to develop another institution that's.
Are you suggesting that the United States develops sort of like European-style data responsibility? I can't remember the correct name of it.
Well, that would be, it depends on how you'd set it up. If it's a federal government privacy officer, like Canada has, the UK has, you need to trust that person. Right? So I think there is now a problem about trust. The three words of trust, federal government, and data, is now very problematic. Maybe that will decay. So if any of you are historians of this, in 1965, which is kind of amazing, there was a proposal to link together all data on people in the country. To get your Social Security record, blend it with your census records, your food stamp records, your IRS tax returns, all of that. And, that would be cool in terms of understanding people. It hit, you can still get this online, I think. You should listen, or you should watch, read the discussion in the House about this. It led to a statement by a congressman, I think from Arkansas, who said, we're on the road. If we do this, the next step is you're going to tell my daughter that she has to marry this person. I don't know how he made that leap, but the emotions ran high. And so deep in this country, I think for decades, forget about NSA, there's been a distrust of the central government to be a good steward of data. And this is a deeply American thing, I think. So even then, I don't think it was possible. NSA probably made it worse. And what I think we need is a different scheme. And by the way, that institution would have to be governed by the privacy lobby, partly. And it'd have to be transparent. Every use of data would have to be, noted and so on.
I'm wondering, for people who are new to data analysis, I know context is important, but if you can generalize a little bit, what are some questions you ask yourself when you get a new data set and you want to go about breaking it down and seeing what's inside? Or what are some of how do you kind of frame your thinking when you're going at a new data set?
Actually, I'm doing that right now. So I think we're gathering up data from Georgetown data sources. They've never been analyzed. They've only been used for program administration, right? So we're doing this stuff, right? His question is, what do you do when you get a data set for the first time? So I look for missingness, first of all. What fields, how bad is the missingness? I look for stupidities that could arise from just data entry things, so out of range thing. I look at a lot of crosstabs of data to see if there are anomalies in it. And then this is much harder, this coverage stuff, what population is it actually describing is key. If you don't know that, you don't know what to do with a statistic off that data set, right? So that's generally the least well documented, who's not there. And then I look for duplicates. It's a fairly straightforward step-by-step thing. And then I'll probably start doing, relational analysis to look again for anomalies. So I actually don't get to doing what I want to do. That's about 80% of the work. And I bet big data is like 99% of the work, right? Something like that. So the analyses you see in the papers you're reading on empirical stuff, is like a tip of the iceberg. There are 400 times more things that you don't even know about. But you got to do those 400 to get to the tip. Yeah, so the stuff that's going on now is mainly blending together survey data that weren't designed to be blended together, right? So you don't actually know how they might fit together. And a lot of the modeling, one way to think about this is if you're thinking about just a multivariate model, that you might actually measure covariances among variables in the model from multiple data sources. And some of the covariances are only measurable from one data source. So it's piecing together covariance matrices with replicated measures of the covariance and then trying to model the variation in the covariance on that. So the models end up being, first of all, very complicated, and the kind of rigorous work that's going on here is not just to, estimate the model, but actually do tons of diagnostic sensitivities on would you make a different inference if you did something slightly different. So it's building that up. What's going to happen, I think, in the survey big data blend is that we're going to link on space and time, because a lot of the new data sources have time tags on them. Sometimes they have space tags, and survey data will have the space in a confidential data set. So I think that's going to be the big leverage that we'll try to do. Yep.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you think the future of big data is and what are the potentials and the limitations for it are. I'm not an expert or anything in like statistics or data, but like having done some reading, like I know a lot of corporations and also the federal government really believe in the predictive power of big data. And I've read a lot of people believe like are making pretty significant claims about like what big data can really do. I think one that comes to mind is many experts in the cybersecurity field believe that predictive analytics will be able to help like stop intrusions before they happen and stuff like that. What do you kind of think about all that? What do you think is the future of big data?
I think this panel that's following me is going to answer that question entirely well. So I think we're going to, David, I agree with David. Do you hear what he said, that, that we're in the hype phase right now? And I thought the hype phase would be over by now, but we're still in the hype phase. So the stuff that's coming out is just unbelievable, right? So I think, your obligation and my obligation is to be very critical of the value of that information and do it the way when you're in a debate in class or with friends, be tough on the data. Why should we believe that? Does it do that? Does it do that? How did you do this? Where did the data really come from? How did you actually do this? And the problem of the American public is, it's just the statistic that comes out in a one sentence thing. So you're not privy to how that was done. But, we have to be better than that. And so in this initial phase, I think we just have to be very harsh and skeptical of the data. And then I guess my other speculation is these things that are using a single data source are going to burn out because there's just not enough information. And we're going to find weird correlations that exist because we haven't measured another phenomenon that would make that correlation disappear if you brought that other variable in. And so you're going to get this. Well, I was talking at lunch. There's this book called Big Data. I hope the author is not in the audience. But so I heard him on a radio interview, and he said, and the interviewer said, so what insights, how can the world be more efficient from the big data? And he said, well, I have a great example of this. I've been analyzing the performance of cars, the longevity of cars, and I've discovered that orange cars last longer than any other color. And the interviewer said, well, wow, that's really fascinating. So practically, what would you do with that finding? And he said, I don't know about you, but the next car I'm going to buy is going to be orange. Now, so he had the car color, he had how long the cars last, but he didn't have a lot of other attributes. So to to assert, as he was, I believe, implicitly, that the color of the car produces how long it will last, that's a causal link, is just crazy. So there's got to be more of that stuff happening. And your job is to say, hogwash, that's crazy. For the following reasons. There's a difference between correlation and causation and so on. One more question, I'm told. So, yeah.
Everyone has their own definition of big data. When I think of big data, I think of Hadoop, unstructured data. I want to ask you, are you doing anything with unstructured data?
Well, I'm a provost, so I do nothing. You haven't heard about this job, right? Provosts don't do anything. So I think unstructured data is we didn't talk much about that, except I was talking about moving from text to, but I could have talked about moving from, video pixels to numbers too. There are all sorts of things. So that'll be a great new field. And on the text side, this should be the decade for computational linguists, Full Employment Act for computational linguists. We got to get computational linguists working with social scientists. The mapping of words to numbers is, has huge literatures in various fields that are going to be renewed. So yeah, that's in there for sure. So yeah, I don't want to limit it just to nicely structured data. Thank you very much.